Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. It's me, Tigre Gardenia. So last week, I traveled to Padova for a conference called Plant Facts, a matter of communication. This is an international conference or kind of scientific meeting that was to look at plants with the aim of unveiling a more comprehensive, let's say, comprehensive meaning of their way of communicating. And Padova is only about, well, only about 5 hours away when you count the driving and the train. So when I saw the list of speakers, I just couldn't pass up the opportunity. I was so excited to have a conference of this type in my own backyard. I mean, literally, it was a 2 day conference, and I went for 2 days. I left at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday, and I came back by like 8 p.m. on a Thursday. It was very, very quick. But there was researchers like František Baluška and Elizabeth Van Valkenburg and James Cahill, who are all people that I have been studying and commenting about for years. So you can't even imagine my excitement when I saw the entire lineup, the topic, the fact that it was so close. And interestingly enough, it was in the Department of Psychology, which was probably another piece that was completely intriguing me. I mean, why is a plant conference in the Department of Psychology, if not because we're starting to get away from the idea of just the physiological aspects of plants, and we're starting to finally get to the true heart of who a plant is? Some of the topics that they covered were, for example, self and society. Plants communicate to organize and coordinate behavior. Plant communication, diversity of alarm calls and their effectiveness. Underground whispers, understanding how and why plants communicate in the rhizosphere. I mean, seriously, these are just the topics that I'm completely enthralled with. And one of the unexpected topics that caught my attention was the topic of Scototropism, which is literally growing towards darkness. I mean, growing towards darkness. Not, and I'm like looking at my notes because I'm looking at when it came up, and I was just sitting there going, I had to write it in big words, Scototropism. I had forgotten about this concept. This is not to be confused with the idea of avoiding light, which is not what we're going to be talking about. Tropism, just for those of you that don't know, tropism is what kind of the way we describe plant senses, the idea of growing towards or doing or moving towards or away from something. So phototropism is growing towards light, and scototropism is growing towards the darkness, not to be confused with each other, which is avoidance of one or the other. So I'm going to get really into it because this is super interesting, especially because shadow work is a big part of my study into personalities, limiting beliefs, and conditioning, which are kind of at the heart of my, my coaching work, my mentorship work is really around understanding and finding your authentic self, and therefore understanding your personalities, which, by the way, even the topic of plant personalities came up, which I was shocked about because personalities, again, is a psychological concept, a cognitive concept. So the idea of discussing plant personalities implies that we're stepping again away from this mechanistic. But again, I'll put that off to a side. You can see my excitement. My voice is getting faster. I'm trying to slow down because I want to share everything with you. But you better believe that my ears perked up when I heard these scientists talking about when plants deliberately they choose to grow towards the darkness. And so looking at it from the perspective of the shadow work, it brings me to today's topic. Today is episode 77, when to grow towards the dark. Welcome to Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. I'm your host, Tigrila Gardenia, nature-inspired mentor and leadership coach. In this podcast, I share ancient and modern knowledge from biology to spirituality about the wondrous ways in which plants can help you lead a naturally conscious life. Okay, notwithstanding that I've been working closely with plants for over a decade to share their practical wisdom with you, to consciously embody the elements of life that nourish your evolution, plants never cease to amaze me. And this was a common theme among all the researchers at the conference. Even after decades of research, even after breaking plants down to their cellular level, they are as excited as kids in a candy store when they discover something new that plants do on purpose, especially something that they once thought was random. So there was even this like word fight tuffle between two scientists over whether mechanistic science that breaks everything down into its like smallest parts can ever get to a true plant's intentions. Because the problem there is that when you break things down too far, you kind of lose sight of the sum of the parts, which is really much greater than the individual elements. In other words, we know that plants have this complex way of being, the same way as we as humans have this complex way of being. And we are finally, at least I already know this, but I am not beholden to the academic world the way some of these scientists are, where they're starting to understand and realize that when you take all of the things that plants do at a mechanistic or at a deep biological level, and you start to sum that up, it still doesn't give us the agency, the intentionality, even the personalities that we're starting to see. So there has to be more. And it was interesting to see this scuffle happen between two different scientists that were looking at it from different points of view. One that was saying, hey, I'm a plant physiologist, and I'm starting to realize that this way of looking at plants is not working. It's not helping us get to the true essence of who a plant is. And these other, scientists that are saying, no, we need to keep breaking it down. We need to keep, dissecting and chopping up and seeing how the chemicals are flowing through. And that's the only way we're going to understand. So I got into some of this in the discussion in last week's plant consciousness commentary, which is called Plants as Electronic Plastic Interfaces, a Mesological Approach. I know it's a pretty scary sounding title, especially if you've never watched any of my plant consciousness commentary, which is exactly why I host these commentary sessions. My goal really there is to break down the science into these kind of bite-sized chunks. I know it sounds like I just went against my whole mechanistic thing. Let me rephrase it. It's the idea of how do we understand where the scientists are going towards, what is it that they're trying to accomplish and state, and where does the science help us better understand our own personal development. That's really the essence. It's really the essence of all of my work. And so here I come to you more from the perspective of the behavior and of the understanding of the human condition, where in the plant consciousness commentary, I come at it first from the perspective of the plant science and taking a paper where we're talking about how plants do something, or plant consciousness or plant neurobiology, or the intelligence that plants are expressing, or even the artistic interspecies development that we're starting to have. And I bring it to you, and then I apply it to, how is it that we look at our lives, our own consciousness, our own authentic selves. So this really gives you sort of two avenues and two windows into doing this. In this particular last paper that I went into, I delve into this fascinating paper by Mark Williams de Bono and Gustavo Souza. Now, Gustavo Souza was at Plant Facts, and it was funny when his slides were going up and I saw him talking about this paper. It reminded me that it was in the queue. It was like the next one for me to do. So it was like perfect synchronicity. And Souza is really proposing that plants drive intelligent behavior through synchronized electrical networks. So the idea that there's an electrical network that is what plants are using primarily to be able to, for lack of a better term, express their intelligence or express their intentionality. So they use these electrical systems. We know that we also have electrical systems, but they're just saying that plants kind of use and have the awareness can be measured through these electrical systems, and that we can understand cognition through these electrical systems. It's a theory that Gustavo Souza is looking into, and I highly encourage you to go check out this paper, especially because Souza's enthusiasm and his out-of-the-box thinking is really, it's palpable. You can feel it. And so rather than relying on anthropocentric ideas of cognition, they are really arguing that plants demonstrate this sort of unique form of perpetual learning and perceptual learning and intelligence that's rooted in bioelectrical systems. like I said, this was not taken very well by some of the mechanistic scientists from Italy who preferred to think of plants as living objects that rely on predictable sort of ways of being. And though, even though they can't understand the patterns, in my opinion, hint, hint, because there is no pattern, because again, it's intention based. But, anyways, they think that the reason is because they just haven't found the pattern yet. So, look, I'll put a link in the show notes and, so that you can go check out my commentary session. It's really simple. It's just my website, tigregardenia.com/commentary. And there you can check out all the old ones. You can also go over to my YouTube where you'll find many of the videos. So, anyways, back to scototropism. Let's talk about scototropism, because the easiest way for me to explain my thinking and why I was so excited when they reminded me and gave me additional information about scototropism, and it fit perfectly with the work on, again, personalities, limiting beliefs, and conditioning that I am doing right now, is thinking of jungle vines. Big jungle vines. Imagine, Amazonian rainforest jungle vines like devil's ivy or Monstera gigantea. Yes, we know Monstera at home, but we're talking about the really big ones that we find out in the jungle. So, Scototropism is a special mechanism that some vines have evolved in order to enable them to find a tree on which to climb on. Again, these are vines, which means that these vines need to find a sort of host plant, a plant on which they can anchor themselves onto, and then kin can grow from there. So scototropism has developed, it's an adaptation. Again, remember when we talk about plants and we talk about the senses that plants have, the senses that plants have developed over time. Remember that my theory is that we also have many of these senses. We have also the ability to create these senses, but because of our conditioning, we have sort of shut many of them down and shut this ability down, right? The idea that every time we start to hear of somebody with extrasensory perception, any kind of perception that is beyond the five senses that we know, we tend to start looking at them with words that most of society will think of as negative, like weird or sick or something is wrong with you, rather than looking at them as an adaptation and an expansion. So for me, working closely with the plants has enabled me as well as my clients, and I see this now all around me, to expand my perceptions, both the perceptions that I currently have, my senses that I currently have, as well as to more comfortably and easily expand out into other perceptions that, in my opinion, we have shut down. So scototropism is definitely one of these types of senses and perceptions, because this is something that plants have enabled, certain types of plants have enabled as a mechanism to achieve an end that is extremely important for them. So most plants, when we think of them, grow phototropically. So the idea is that plants grow towards light, right? Heliotropism, or growing specifically towards sunlight, and phototropism, which means I grow towards light waves that are nutritious to me in some way, because they trigger photosynthesis, because they show me where there are open space, because they show me many different aspects. So these are aspects that plants have developed and refined over the years, or over the millennia probably, where we as humans have kind of really pared this down to its very basics. But in the case of jungle vines, they've also expanded on and grow towards the darkness. So this is that scototropism. And they do this because they are looking for a solid support system before their growth. So let me explain it a little better. When a jungle vine is like not yet attached to any kind of large tree or any kind of base that will give them the opportunity to grow, they, rather than going towards the light, which implies open space, right? When I have a large amount of light coming through, most likely I have large amounts of space, a canopy that's not very thick, which would imply I don't get the things that I need to create a solid foundation, because these plants need a nice, big, solid base that can hold the weight as they begin to grow. So these plants instead choose to follow darkness until they have found a solid support system. Once they find that safety, and once they have a solid base of a large tree that they feel can hold their weight, their growth, where they're going to be going, then they can change from scototropism to phototropism and start growing towards the light. And this is what's going to give them the nutrients that they need in order to grow in size. So think about this really carefully, which is plants are moving towards and flipping between scototropism and phototropism as necessary, between growing towards the darkness in order to build a foundation, in order to find my solid ground, in order to hook into the elements that will allow me to be safe. And then from there, the plants are growing up towards phototropism, to where there is more space to express, where I can become big in my own self, where I can feel like I can get the nourishment I need to create those giant leaves. If you think about a Monstera gigantea, right? We're talking about gigantic leaves. So take a second right now and think about your own darkness, or better said, your shadow self, as most often it's called, right? How do you talk about it when you're talking about the shadow? Do you see yourself ever as growing toward it? Listen to the words. The words are important in this case. When I think of my shadow, I'm probably not thinking about growing towards it. I think of it more as maybe I have to get into or even connect to my shadow side, but I don't see it as a point of growth. So, what I really want to talk about today is about when you should grow towards it, when you should think of this as a point of growth in order, very similar to these jungle vines like devil's ivy, to create a new platform, a new foundation, a new base of sorts. So let's stick with the biology for a second, just to give us a reference point, because this is one of those concepts that is very shrouded in, how do I say this? It's very shrouded in conditioning, in fearful words, shadow, dark, the blackness, all of these aspects. And this makes it sometimes very hard for us to understand how important it is for us to work with these concepts and into these different aspects of myself. So getting into the biology sometimes, no, not sometimes, always gives us an opportunity to sort of strip away that conditioning and think of it more from the natural tendencies that these concepts or these abilities afford me. So what are the possibilities within them? And then I can reapply it to my humanness using without that filter, without that sort of layer of meaning and conditioning that oftentimes hurts us. So let's go back to the biology for a reference point. So before 1975, for example, a wide range of explanations have been offered to explain how it was a vine knew when to start climbing. So when would a vine be close to the ground and growing and searching, and when instead that vine could start moving upwards towards the light? And among them, the most common answer before 1975, except for there was one instance of somebody in 1925 that started to talk about the idea of scototropism without the name, but they just didn't have the test data to be able to show this. So 1975, a series of researchers who are in the jungle start to see a phenomenon and start to study this because they originally thought these were actually animal biologists. They were, I think, what's it called? Entomologists. They were studying insects. And then they decided, they saw this vine that was growing in the darkness and they knew that plants normally go towards the light, so they couldn't understand what was happening. And they decided to study because they thought there was a form of negative phototropism. So the idea of growing away from the light, which was what was happening. So, or that there was maybe some kind of random searching that the plant was doing, or maybe even some negative geotropism. So the idea of growing against the pull of gravity of some sort. They were looking at all these different things. Now, notice how the human mind works, right? Their first inclination was to grow towards something negative. I am trying to avoid. Why? Because that's the human tendency, right? Plants tend to be present. They tend to be active into whatever situation they have to be in because they can't run away. But we as humans tend to run away. So it is normal that our first thought process is negative something tropism. In this case, negative phototropism. The idea that the plant is growing away from the sun, maybe for fear of being burned, maybe for some other aspect, which does happen, but not in this case. In negative phototropism, a plant would grow at 180 degrees angle away from the light. So if you have a light source that's coming from one angle, 180 degrees in the other direction is where the plants would go. And this makes sense for plants that like low light conditions. So they display a form of negative phototropism when exposed to very, very bright light. But when researchers discovered that certain plants in really dense jungle conditions were doing something different, they decided to study this and start taking some measurements in the field. And they designed some experiments that clearly showed them that the seedlings of these vine plants, such as Monstera gigantella, was really seeking out the darkness, irrespective of where the light might be. So it didn't matter if light was really bright in one direction. What they were really looking for was not that 180 degrees in the opposite direction. They were looking for the darkness. And as the seedlings grew, they kept their heads up like having a radar that knew which direction was up. So they really knew that up was this way, and therefore I could search for the darkest elements. Now, why were they looking for the darkest elements? Look, the journey for a plant, especially a vine, to find a host tree is super treacherous, right? You can be distracted by little twigs that maybe you think is going to be a tree, or maybe there's other kinds of debris that's around. And so the only thing you can rely on is the fact that in a dense forest, the base of a tree, which is the element that's going to get the biggest, right? That's going to be the strongest buttress for you, that's going to create the strongest base and foundation for you, is going to be in the dark. So Kin discovered that this is the path towards the greatest future growth. Go into the darkness now. Approach things using other senses and other abilities, not necessarily your sense of sight, and probably not some of the other senses that require a certain amount of light sensitivity in order for you to connect to that. And instead, grow into the darkness and find yourself what will create you a base foundation. Once you have that foundation set, once you have found your tree buttress, your tree pole, for lack of a better term, now start to climb. And so at that point, the plants, the Monstera in this case, completely abandons all of this scototrophic behavior and becomes phototrophic. Now, all of a sudden, this tree or this plant, that was growing towards darkness changes direction and starts growing through the light. So putting out these monstrous saucer-shaped leaves just to make sure that they can get enough food from the photosynthesis, even still while they're down in the canopy. Like once they're down still low, on their way up, they start to spread out and create these big leaves and start to capture the light. So what does it have to do with you, right? All of this explanation of the biology. Now the question is, how do we apply this biology to your personal development? But before we get into this, I want to share with you one of our eco-conscious business partners. Hey there, plant lovers. If you're as fascinated by the intelligence, communication, and deep wisdom of plants as I am, I've got something you'll love. Have you checked out my bookshop.org store yet? It's the go-to spot for all the Plant Wisdom book club selections and some of my absolute favorite reads on the wondrous world of plants. Whether you're curious about how plants thrive or how we can benefit from thinking like them, there's a book for you. Plus, by shopping through bookshop.org, you're supporting independent bookstores and the incredible world of nature-based wisdom. You'll discover books you may not have come across otherwise, ones that will open your eyes to how much plants have to teach us on both personal and societal levels. So check out my link on my US and UK shops in the show notes and dive into the world where nature's intelligence takes center stage. Let's read, learn, and reconnect with the wisdom of plants together. And hey, you can also join the book club. It's on my website, the Plant Wisdom Book Club. Okay, so here's the question. How can all this Scototropism be applied to your life? The truth is, all of our personalities have a shadow equivalent. And that's actually not as clear-cut as that sentence might sound. I know it sounds as if we're thinking about, personalities as always being light, and then there's this dark, nefarious shadow side that exists. But honestly, there are no personalities or characteristics that we have that are always in the shadow or that are always in the light. In other words, depending on how you are and your experience, you might have thrown a personality into the light, basically giving them more of the stage, showing them more to the public, being a personality that you lean with. And then there is a counterbalance to that personality that you have most likely obstructed, something that you have put into the shadows. So and a lot of this also has to do with the way society views those characteristics. There are certain characteristics that have been codified into society in certain way, so they've become the norm. And we look at them as if those are the ones in the light and the atrophied parts are the ones in the shadow, even though those can be actually quite harmful to yourself and to others. And what you have atrophied are actually the parts of your personality that are really quite healthy for you. And so you've just treated them way. So it's not a given that light and shadow are really considering are the equivalent of good and bad. It's more of light and shadow is what do I have out in the light and what instead have I atrophied or diminished or am hiding into the darkness. In the interactive webinar that I have coming up, Befriend Your Limiting Beliefs, so you can do things you once thought impossible, I'm going to share some of my story of how my own characteristics that I once thought were negative or in the shadow, and I now realize that those are actually my true source of light, the source of really my talents. And I've kind of found a new balance and a new flow that happens between them. So check that out. Again, it's in the show notes. But for most of us, we often see the shadow as a source of humiliation that we have to try to hide, or oftentimes we think of it as some kind of maybe perfectionism or control or judgment. These are actually really counterintuitive truths. They don't work. And it's what happens when we try to put labels on things that really shouldn't have those labels. So when we instead reveal the shadow, when we give in to the non-conforming talents that are usually hiding inside of that shadow side of ourselves, the nature of those personalities or characteristics changes and they become a source of creativity and confidence. Look, we have to remember that we live in a world of dualism, which means that the true whole of our personalities, if we think about our personalities as more of a circle rather than a line, right? Is that you have to integrate the light and the dark, and that there's shades and gradients and flowing from one or the other, because each one of them has a benefit. So when the shadow is an active form of life, you learn how to master those talents along with those that are in the light. And there becomes this flow. It's almost as if you have to think about a personality at 360 degrees. And most of the time, we have put into the light only one piece of it, and we've thrown into the shadow the other side of it. And this brings me to why working with vines such as the Monstera can be so powerful. Why is it that we could work with these types of plants who have this encoded memory of this scototropism? And how do we take that scototropism and actually apply it onto ourselves as necessary and kind of reawaken our own scototropism? Because really, if you think about it, who knows how to successfully grow in the shadow more than these masters of dark, who can teach you how to activate your own scototropism and how to use it to find the support and a new sense of home, right? To find that foundation or that base. Think about it. Monstera and plants like Ki first conquer their shadow, then they grow towards the light. In other words, kin know how to do both. And when you work closely with these types of vines, or even with any plant, but you tap into your plant partner's scototropism, it gives you the opportunity to first find a new foundation, to open yourself up to those parts of yourself that you might have been hiding, those parts of you that maybe have atrophied over time, and to give space for them to be a part of your life, and then to bring them with you as you grow towards the light. But in also knowing that in times of necessities, you can turn around and grow towards the dark. In other words, it gives you much more flexibility and much more access to your overall personalities and who you are. Basically, if you think about it, Monstera first builds their personal foundation by going into the dark, even though it's scary, even though they're not really sure where they're going to find, even though they're not really sure where the support is actually located. But they know that only when this has been found can they start to grow into the light. And this is really what I see with my clients. Oftentimes, when we start working together, what we do is break down, go into that dark shadow self, because we're trying to understand what are the talents that they have atrophied. And you see this a lot with limiting beliefs. Limiting belief, in some ways, is a bodyguard that gets placed between the light and the shadow. It's a bodyguard that you place between certain ones of your talents or your skills, because there's some reason why you want to hide these into the shadow world. And then what happens is that you spend all this time in the light. Whether the light is healthy or not is not even the case, because what's happening is that that limiting belief in the middle has now blocked off your access, and you don't know how to go toward this. So when you find yourself in these types of situations, what you want to do is call in your scototropic support. You want to really activate that type of perception, that type of sense inside of you, so that then from there, you can work in a much more concerted way with that shadow self. Now you have access to what's in the darkness without it being scary, but instead looking at it from the perspective of, I'm looking for a new foundation. I'm trying to understand what is in there in order to make that a new base for myself. What do I need to build up? Who do I need to grab onto? Who do I need to ignore? Who do I need to break down? There's all different aspects of this work. And that scototropism is a fantastic way for you to access parts of yourself that you didn't even know you had within you. And therefore, from there, you can then move towards working more clearly or more fluidly with that shadow self. Think of your shadow self, think of that darkness as a resource rather than something to be avoided. Just like Monstera finds stability in the darkness before growing towards the light, you too can explore your own darkness. Grow. You can think of it as, these are areas that you've hidden, that you've ignored, that you might have even feared. And it's here that tapping into your plantness as, that operating in the darkness. Remember, all plants, all plants live one part of their life in the air and one part of the life underground. So one part, even air plants and such, have those small root systems that are not facing towards the light directly. There's always the possibility for you to be in the light as well as in the darkness. And so you need to understand how that aspect of yourself exists. And so it's here that you can discover a foundation strong enough to support your authentic growth, and where you can find those parts of yourself that you've been hiding, but that you've been hiding, you sort of feel like they're missing in your life, and now you can express them more authentically. Look, oftentimes society encourages us to bypass this process, teaching us to focus only on the light, right? I am a light being and all of this beautiful stuff connecting to the light being. But we need light and darkness. We're in duality. And so we need to experience that. We need daytime, we need nighttime, we need light sources, we need dark sources. We need to look at the things that we express, and we need to look at the things that we hide. All of them have a place and a function. And once you take away the label of good or bad, and instead you look at them based on characteristics, abilities, talents, and skills, then you can really start to understand who you are, your true nature. Because the truth is that personal development, really embodying your true self, your authentic self, requires embracing the full spectrum, both the light and the dark. And by acknowledging and working with your shadow self, you set the stage for deeper, more meaningful growth. Imagine what you could accomplish if you learned to draw strength from the parts of yourself that you've kept hidden. Some of them which should remain hidden. They're parts of you, they're elements of you that are in that hiding space because that's where they should be. Not because you're ashamed, not because they're atrophied, not because you don't know how to work with them, but instead because they're a fountain or source that is coming up from the darkness. So understanding the difference between those two, between what are things that I've put into the darkness, but in reality are things that should be in the light, versus what are things that should stay in the darkness because I pull from them and I source them when they are best in that state. You see the difference? That's the big difference of working closely with a plant in order to understand, especially if you have a plant like a Monstera, where a Monstera, you could really find that grounding, understanding the role of that darkness. And then once you do that, trust me, you will naturally turn towards the light, ready to thrive. So just as Monstera needs to find that solid support in the darkness, so do we in our own journey of growth. So do you. It can be super challenging to explore these hidden parts of yourselves, those aspects that you've been conditioned to ignore or suppress. But once you learn how to embrace your shadow and navigate it with intention, oh my goodness, it becomes one of the greatest tools for transformation. Seriously, it's like having a battery, right? This battery that's sitting deep, deep, dark inside of yourself that you can pull from constantly because, again, you're not suppressing, but instead you're cherishing, you're honoring, you're nourishing even in that deep, dark space because it's a part of you and it's a relationship with you. It's so amazing. You really learn how to embrace your shadow and then you can navigate it with intention. It becomes really one of your greatest tools. And this is where having a guide can make all the difference in the world. You don't have to navigate this process alone. I know it's tempting. I know sometimes it's even scary or embarrassing. But as a nature inspired mentor and a certified life coach, look, I've worked with creative, multi passionate individuals like you every day who explore their inner darkness to discover this untapped strength and bring those into the light, to over time master those talents, to become someone who can exercise all of their different skills, knowing when to use one, when to instead put one down, all these different aspects. Together, we'll use the lessons of the plants like the Monstera to help you embrace your shadow and build a foundation for your authentic self and to grow towards the life that you were really meant to lead. If you're ready to stop being molded by others and start living from a place of genuine authenticity, I invite you to connect with me. Everything you need is in the show notes. Let's explore your unique growth path and uncover how your own version of Scototropism can guide you to a life of impact and of flow and of purpose. So if you're feeling drawn to explore mentorship or coaching, I'd love to connect with you. You can book a call with me through the link in the show notes, and we'll dive into what support you need to really flourish. And on my website, you can also find more details and even find a quiz to help you identify the right mentorship program for you. And if you're looking for an ongoing community and support, join the Naturally Conscious community. Our vibrant online space for deepening your connection to plant wisdom and accelerating personal growth is just one click away. Inside, you'll find meaningful discussions, interactive courses, live events, and a community of like-minded individuals, all supporting each other through our plant-inspired journey. And I'd love to see you there and hear about your experiences. Really, let's walk this path of evolution together because we know that we evolve faster when we do it all united. So that's it for this episode. Remember to like, to comment, and to subscribe. Oh, well, and also to share it. Tell your friends about it. And remember to resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. This is it for me, Tigria Gardenia. I'm out. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of ReConnect with Plant Wisdom. Intro and outro music by Steve Shuley and Monstera from The Singing Life of Plants. So join me, Tigria Gardenia, and my plant collaborators next time on ReConnect with Plant Wisdom. Speak soon.